So we had a funny moment in our house this last week. So this is the third week in this making space for what matters most. You'd think I'd have that title down pat by now. And last week was all about Sabbath and rest, and we got home and we were preparing for our small group to come over, our Bible study, family, fellowship kind of group, parents and kids to come over. And as we were getting ready, my husband said, I think you should leave that little pile of pine needles and floor, like the night before, Saturday night, it wasn't that I was trying to clean for them. I could not stand what I was feeling on my feet as I walked across our floor. So I'd swept a pile right before bed, just frantically, in the kitchen, but I left it there knowing I would get it the next day. And we get home from church and he says, I think you should leave that there. It's it was in plain view. It was right there. It was this big. It was a lot of dirt. And I was like, why? He's like, because it'll prove to others that we're taking the Sabbath seriously. Do you know how hard it was not to sweep up that pile? Katie can testify. I left it there. I did. That was really hard for me. That was really hard for me, and I think a little bit funny for him. On a serious note, I think making room for what matters most is hard. I think it's hard. It's not easy to find time for rest and for Sabbath and for other people. As crazy as that sounds, sometimes it's not easy to find time for other people. It's hard to simplify, to maybe even eliminate a few things from our box in order to make room for the most important things. But this issue of margin in our lives is crucial for us. It is crucial as followers of Jesus who long to honor God in all we say and in all we do. And like I said, today we're talking about this margin in our lives for others, creating space in our schedules, our days, so that our relationships and the people in our lives who maybe aren't even in relationship with us, but God is putting in our lives so that they flourish. And I think so that we can live into the second part of what Jesus says is the most important thing. You might know that when asked what the most important commandment is, Jesus said, and we get this in Matthew 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands: relationship to God and relationship with other people. That's most important, at least according to Jesus. And the key to discipleship, which is just a big word for growing deeper in our faith, growing closer to God each step of the way, is learning to do these two things really well: love God and love others. Relationships, I'm not saying anything you don't know, can be hard, right? We all know that they don't just happen. Whether we're talking about our relationship with God or our relationship with those God puts in our lives, they take effort, they take commitment, they take intentionality, they take margin. How many people are you good friends with that you haven't spent time with? I think also intentionally living so that others flourish, which is sort of the second part of what we're talking about today, putting others first doesn't come naturally. At least it doesn't always come naturally for me. It doesn't just happen. It takes effort, commitment, intentionality, and margin. And it's the margin that we're talking about today. The text that we're looking at picks up, it's a narrative, it's chapter 2 out of a 4-chapter, really small narrative known in the Old Testament as the Book of Ruth. I love this story. It reads just like a soap opera. If you don't believe me, go home and read it, the whole thing afterwards. But it's a soap opera that, unlike the ones on television, give us a lot to chew on, a lot to think about, especially as we're talking about making space for others. We're picking up in chapter 2, so I want to bring you up to speed. The story starts in chapter 1 in Moab, where an Israelite woman named Naomi lives with her family. Years earlier, because of famine, Naomi and her husband and 2 sons left the promised land in search of greener pastures. A little irony there, right? They left the promised land to go find greener pastures. Unfortunately, Naomi's husband pretty quickly dies, and she's left with her 2 sons. Well, they grow, and they eventually marry, and they marry Moabite women named Ruth, name of the book, and Orpah. They are Moabite women. They get married to the 2 sons, and then boom, the 2 sons die. Not a happy story. So there's Naomi, an Israelite widow stuck in Moab, feeling like God is punishing her, trying to figure out how to care for herself and her young daughters-in-law, which is certainly not easy, especially in that culture where there wasn't much hope for livelihood or a future for those who were widowed. So understandably, they decide that it's best that they head back to Israel, where the famine was over and Naomi's extended family still lived. But pretty quickly on their journey, they don't get very far when Naomi kind of realizes this is not going to be the best choice for Orpah and Ruth. And so she says to them, go on back. Go to your people, go back to your gods. You're going to have a chance at a life there that you will not have with me in Israel. I don't even have a chance in Israel, is sort of her message. And so Orpah agrees, and she heads back. Can't blame her for that. I think I might have made the same decision. But Ruth makes a different choice, insisting on staying with Naomi out of a loyalty to her as her mother-in-law. And in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, again, we're going to pick up in chapter 2, Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you from me. Wow. Those are really strong words. And Naomi pretty quickly realizes Ruth is willing to cut ties with her people, with her gods, in order to keep a commitment that she made to her mother-in-law. And with that, Naomi realizes she's not going to change Ruth's mind. And so this determined young woman heads out with her mother-in-law, and they go back to Bethlehem in Israel. And they happen to arrive, a glimmer of hope in the midst of darkness, at the time that the barley harvest is happening. All right? So that's where we're going to pick up the story. I've always admired Ruth. I've always admired her. This has always been one of my favorite stories. And you would think that today, because of this relationship piece that we're talking about and making room for others, that we'd be focusing on Ruth's commitment to Naomi. But I'm going to give us a plot twist and say that's actually not the relationship we're talking about today. That's not the person we're talking about today. I mean, they're a part of the story, but the person that we're going to be talking about today, where it picks up in chapter 2, is a guy named Boaz, who just happens to be related to Naomi's deceased husband. Did I tell you it was like a soap opera? It's like a soap opera. We're going to pick up in chapter 2. It's on page 243, actually 242 if you want to follow along. I'm going to read the first, I think it's 3 verses, and then I'm going to take a little pause, and then we're going to pick up, but you can just leave it open. Ruth chapter 2, with that background in mind, hear the word of God. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. All right, we're going to stop there for just a minute because it's important. Imagine the scene. Ruth and Naomi are thinking that they've got to take care of first things first, right? They got to take care of figuring out what they're going to eat because they don't have any income, they have no money, they're in this land, they're widowed, right? So first things first, what are they going to eat? So Ruth proposes that she go into the fields which are being harvested, and she glean behind the harvesters with the other people who are gleaning. Do you know what gleaning is? Some of you might. Gleaning is the practice of following behind the harvesters and being allowed to collect what is left over. If we look at Leviticus chapter 19, we're going to see that in the Israelite culture, at that time, it was an expected practice for landowners to participate in. It was expected that they leave behind a little bit of what was there. So we look at Leviticus. This is where the Levitical law comes in. When you reap the harvest of your land, again, this is talking to landowners, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not pick or go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so landowners commanded to leave the edges, the margins, if you will, of their fields so that the poor could collect it. It's sort of a welfare work program, if you will, that God ordained and instituted. Gleaning was often dangerous work, especially for women and doubly so for foreign women who didn't have anybody of their own, didn't have their own people to protect them as they were gleaning. So you can imagine some of the things that might have been happening. And so bottom line, Ruth is volunteering to put herself into a vulnerable, possibly dangerous position in order to provide for herself and for Naomi. It seems here that Ruth steps out in faith, believing or hoping on some level. She says that some God-fearing person, I'm putting those words in, but I think that's what she's hoping, will take pity on her and allow her to glean, which is exactly what happens. We pick up in verse 4. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the harvesters are working and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Pretty upright guy, right? It's clear by the way he greets his workers, the Lord be with you, that he honors the Lord. He seems on some level to know his workers. He's interacting with them. And despite their social differences, despite the fact that he didn't know Ruth personally, he knew of her, right? He addresses her as a person, my daughter, rather than a nobody, which he could have addressed her as, or not addressed her at all. And he tells her that she can glean any time she wants with others, to stay there, that it'll be safe, that he's going to provide protection for her. And not only that, but a sign of taking care of her physically. He's going to allow her to get water. That was a big deal. He allowed her to get water from the jars that the men had filled. Can you imagine how those words impacted Ruth in that moment? The outsider, the widow, the nobody, they were likely the first kind words that she heard since she left Moab. Even more, they were words that told her that she was included. She was a part of the community. She was part of God's people who she had come to seek refuge under. Boaz makes it clear that he knew what Ruth gave up to remain faithful to Naomi, and he's essentially praying blessing on her in that moment. That's huge. According to one commentator, Ruth, the outsider, had been made to feel welcome and come in. The one who came seeking Israel's God had for the first time been made to feel that there might be a place for her among the followers of God. And the text goes on. Like I said, I encourage you to go home and read it. It's only 4 chapters. It will not take you long. It goes on to reveal even more about how Boaz cared for Ruth, telling the harvesters to leave extra for her to glean, not just the normal amount. She carried home somewhere between 29 and 50 pounds of grain that first day. That's a lot. And that Boaz also invited her to eat with them, filling her belly for the first time since they'd left Moab, really filling it to the point where she was full. If we had time to read the rest, we'd find out that the soap opera progresses with Naomi scheming to get Boaz to marry Ruth. He does just that in a fully upright and righteous and appropriate way, and they have a son, and it all ends well in this line of David. Does that sound familiar? Jesus comes from the line of David. It all ends well for these 2 women who thought they had no future. They thought they had no future. It's quite a narrative with quite a cast of characters. So the question before us, if we're thinking about Boaz specifically within this, is how was Boaz making space for others? Well, he was doing it by obeying Leviticus 19, the Levitical law, which called him to faithfully leave margin at the edge of his field. He was following God's best expectation for him, and in the process of doing that, he was caring for other people. Quite simply, he was loving God and loving other people. In that order. Boaz understood the answer to a pretty significant, straightforward equation. Love God first, and then you'll be able to love others well. If you try to do those in reverse order, it doesn't go as well. These are the 2 most important things in our lives we can do. Boaz was loving God. He was doing what God asked him to do, living the way God asked him to live, and that allowed him to care for the people around him. It allowed him to bless others, to make space for others as a matter of his daily routine. He didn't have to go out of his way. He didn't add anything. He just did what God asked him to do, aligned his priorities in that order, and it allowed for space for others. Like Boaz, loving God first is the only way that we can effectively love others. And like Boaz, the only way for us to love others well is to make space for them, to be with them, to prioritize them. Now, it's important to say that we cannot assume, I want to be really careful here, we cannot assume that Boaz was doing what he did with relationship building in mind. That would be an overreach for us to say that that is what we get out of this text. We can't say that. I'd like to be able to say that. It was a struggle to figure out how to say that, and we pulled back and said, we can't do that. We cannot assign that assumption to Boaz. He wasn't scheming to find a wife. He wasn't doing this for Ruth. In fact, we can't even say that he was excited about leaving margin. We don't know. Maybe he was bitter about having to do it. At least at first. We don't know. But what we can assume, in fact, we can draw straight from the text, is that he was doing what he was doing because that's what God asked him to do. He was loving God. He was living a life that reflected a morality, a modesty, a lack of greed, a willingness to obey the law, a life that had a lot of structure to it. And it turned out that by living that life, by living inside of the margin that God had asked him to do and called him to do, he was putting himself in a position, in a place of being used by God and having God do something more than he could ever have asked or imagined. He gets a wife. I think it's also important to say that the space that Boaz makes for others, it's visible. It's easy to see, it's clear cut. Leave the edges of your fields. He could look out and he could actually see what the space looked like that God was asking him to leave for others. It was also intensely practical. It wasn't some conceptual thing that he was going to think about differently and maybe shift around a little bit. Maybe you get caught up in that. I do. He literally left the grain for others to pick up. It's really quite simple. The space for others that we're asked to make and to leave margin with isn't quite as clear cut. But at its best, it's still intensely practical, not too conceptual. So that begs the question, what does it look like for us? Well, as I said, like Boaz, I think it first means loving God well. It means understanding God's word and learning to obey what God asks of us. It means ordering our lives, the things in this box that we're going to pull out in a minute, a few of them. It means ordering them, work and cooking, home stuff and school and friends and the gym and our time on our devices and phones. It means ordering all of that in such a way that we're leaning into God's wisdom about how to do it, not our own wisdom about how to do it. It means living into the call to rest and Sabbath, like we heard last week, and generosity, like we'll hear next week, and service. It means ordering our lives according to God's will. And when we do that, leaving margin like Boaz did, if you'll go with me a little bit on that, we too will see God open opportunities for relationships and the flourishing of other people. It will happen. So when we think about all of this, though, with all of this series, we are not asking you to add things. We're not asking you to make space by adding extra space that you think you can just find by cramming everything else into other corners, right? So today I want to think about the things in this box for a second, about how can we do this? How can we leave the margin in what we're already doing, right? So if you think about work, maybe, and I don't want these to be all about extroverts, so maybe you're an introvert and maybe you're at work. And maybe you know that there is somebody who could use an email saying, you know what, we value you on the team. Send the email. Let them know that you value them on the team. Maybe it means making space in your week to prepare a meal for somebody. If you're a cook. If you're not a cook, please don't. Although Eddie's does really well. But maybe it means doing that. Maybe it means opening up your home and getting into a routine where you and your family or you alone are saying, you know what, I have space because I've got to eat anyway. So I'm going to open my home once a week. It's going to be a super simple meal, but I'm going to open it. And I'm going to invite somebody. We've got people in this congregation who are doing that. They eat pizza every Friday. They invite somebody different every time. Maybe it means that on this device, if you're a student, you send a text. Or you figure out how to send a text to that kid in the lunchroom who's not ever sitting with somebody. Or maybe you just go over. You got to eat. Maybe you go sit with them. Maybe you use this phone if you've got aging parents who live a little further away or even in town. And you call them an extra time or two a month to check in on them and let them know that you love them and that you're thinking about them. I don't know what it looks like for you, but the key is not taking the things and shoving them to the sides or thinking we just get rid of things, because all of these things are things that are in our lives. Can't get rid of our family, can't get rid of our job, but what it does mean is making sure, as we've said, that this represents Jesus, that we make sure that the things in our lives are ordered around Jesus and around God's priorities, not the other way around. And as we do that, God will open up opportunities. And in all of this, it's crucial to remember that we don't know the big story. Boaz didn't know how this was going to play out. He didn't know he was going to meet Ruth. He didn't know he was going to get a wife. He didn't know that he was going to be a part of that she was going to be a part of the line of David. Like, none of that. But that's how it played out. It's taking the time for people. And sometimes I want to say it is intentionally making the phone call to the person that you know God has been saying, please get together with this person. Please go have coffee with this person. Last Friday, I had coffee with a friend that we've been trying to get together for quite a long time. She's a member of this congregation. Her name's Katie. She told me that I could tell this story. We had coffee last Friday, and I knew that Katie and her husband had been trying to move closer to the church here, closer to being able to be a part of the body here a little bit more regularly. And I knew that they'd been looking at houses. And so when we had coffee on Friday, which was just delightful, we were talking about some of the houses they were looking at. Saturday morning, so that's Friday. Saturday morning, I wake up somewhat reluctantly, I'm going to admit, but following what God was asking me to do that day, and I showed up, as I should, for session prayer. I love to pray. I don't love it at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning. I'm just going to be honest. It's my only day to theoretically sleep in, and once a month, it's okay, but that means I'm not sleeping in. So I came to session prayer. So I'm on this side of kind of town where the houses are that Katie's been looking at, and I get a text from her right near the end of the prayer time. She had no idea I was here. And it said, hey, I'm just sitting here waiting for the realtor. I'm about to go look at the house for a second time, the one that we'd been talking about that she was most excited about. Just thinking about you, letting you know that I loved our time yesterday. So I text back when we're done. I said, listen, I'm at church. I just finished up prayer. Is your husband with you? Because I know he works often on Saturdays. Or are you by yourself? Would you like some company to look at the house? She's like, oh my gosh, I would love it. And she tells me the address. I go to the address, I pull in, and I realize it's 3 doors down from Kathy, who's right over there. 3 doors down from somebody at Central, who I know Katie would love. And we go look at the house, and I tell her that. I'm like, you live, like, this could be 3 doors down from like a fabulous family. And she's getting more and more excited. And we're leaving a little while later after we look at the house, and I said, do you want to just go see if they're there? Like, I didn't plan this, folks. And do you know who pulled up just as we're like leaving their house because nobody answered? Kathy. She pulls up because she just finished walking with her friend. Katie was super excited about like the potential of a walking group in the neighborhood. And they connected. And they hit it off. And Kathy was ecstatic because she's been praying about who would buy that house. And Katie left there that day, and she went down to where her husband was, and she sat him down, and she said, he had already seen the house, and they were already leaning toward it, but she's like, this is the house. And they put a contract on the house, and they're going to be, if all goes well with the inspection, neighbors with Kathy and her husband. Folks, I didn't plan that. I went and did what I was asked to do that morning. I got a text. I left a little more room for responding and supporting my friend in something. And God did immeasurably more than anybody in that situation could have asked or imagined. And it may seem like a little thing, but I think it's not. That's the way God works. That's the way God orchestrates things. This may seem conceptual for you still. You may be sitting there thinking, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I've got a really intensely practical way. You want an intensely practical way? You may have noticed you had postcards on your seat. Grab that postcard. There are 3 different postcards. How many of you love getting snail mail? Okay, raise your hand. You all know Christmas is your favorite time of year because you get Christmas cards, right? And I mean snail mail other than like the bills and the junk mail that we get, right? We all love it. You're not telling me the truth if you don't say that your eyes light up just a little bit when you actually see a handwritten note coming in the mail. I do. So these postcards are intended to be an intensely practical tool for you. There are 3 of them. 2 of them are funny. At least we hope you think they're funny. One of them they're both funny with a compliment kind of put in there. The one that we think the guys might be most likely to use is funny with a little bit of a jab that's a compliment. That's okay, that was intended. There's somebody on our staff who's not likely to send these often, and when he said, yeah, I would send that, we were like, okay, we hit it, like we got it. Anyway, there's I'm thinking about you, let's get together. There's if I had to choose between bacon and you, which would I choose? I would clearly choose bacon, but let's hang out anyway. And then there's this one that's just hilarious that I think, the image of pushing all the buttons on the elevator. These are a simple tool. Take a postcard home. Take 2 postcards home. Take 5 postcards home. Write a note on them. Let somebody know you'd like to get together with them. You may think, well, I could just text them. You could just text them. And follow up with the text. But bless them with a funny postcard that says, you know what, I value time with you. And then follow up. Do not send a postcard about hanging out with somebody if you are not going to follow up. I'm serious. Don't send me one if you're not going to follow up. I won't send you one if I'm not going to follow up, because that would be worse than not sending one at all. But send a postcard. If you're sitting there thinking, I am not sending a postcard, fine. Don't send a postcard. Take a postcard home and put it on your refrigerator so that you remember to text somebody. You get the point? Use this as a tool to remind you to be a part of people's lives, to open yourself up, to make space. This will require making some space, because if you say, hey, let's get together, you're going to have to find time to do that. Order your life in such a way that God can use you because you have margin. You are available. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two things. Let's pray.